The church bells tolled low and heavy that morning, each strike echoing through the cold December air. Candles flickered against stained glass windows, and the scent of lilies filled the sanctuary. My husband's coffin rested at the front, draped in white roses. I sat in the first pew, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached, 68 years old and suddenly alone. For 10 years, I had cared for Harold through sickness, cooking every meal, managing every doctor's visit, holding his hand when he could no longer stand. But that morning, none of it seemed to matter. Behind me, I heard the whispers. His children, my stepchildren, leaned close, their laughter barely muffled. She thinks she's the grieving widow. Wait until the will's read. She won't get a penny. I kept my eyes on the coffin, but my chest burned. When I rose to give a short eulogy, their smirks followed me up the aisle. As I spoke of Harold's kindness, of the way he believed in family even in hard times, I saw them exchange glances, mocking smiles tugging at their lips. One even muttered loud enough for the row to hear, "Fake tears. She's only here for the money." The congregation shifted uncomfortably, but no one stopped them. I stood there, voice trembling, not from weakness but from rage. They thought they knew how this story would end. They thought they were the rightful heirs, the only ones who mattered. But what they didn't know, what only Harold, his lawyer, and I knew, was that in the final months of his life, he made a decision that would silence their laughter forever. Because when the lawyer opened the folder after the funeral, everything changed. After the service, I sat quietly in the reception hall attached to the church. Plates of finger sandwiches lined the tables, untouched. Guests spoke in hushed tones, sipping coffee, avoiding eye contact with me, as though grief were contagious. I was 68, a widow and suddenly invisible. Harold and I had been married just over a decade. 10 years of cooking his meals, organizing his medications, helping him through the long nights when the pain wouldn't let him sleep. His children rarely visited. Birthdays, holidays. They sent quick texts, sometimes flowers. But it was me who stayed, me who kept his dignity intact. And yet here, on the day of his funeral, I was the one being treated as an intruder. I thought back to our last Christmas together. Harold had insisted we invite everyone, children, grandchildren, neighbors. I baked cookies with the grandkids, their laughter filling the kitchen while Harold sat in his chair, smiling. For a moment, I believed we were a family. That night, as the grandkids drifted to sleep, Harold squeezed my hand and whispered, "No matter what they think, you are my home." Those words stayed with me, even as their warmth began to fade, but the warmth of those days evaporated quickly. At the reception, one of the grandchildren brushed past me without so much as a glance. A boy I had rocked to sleep years before tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered, "Can we leave now?" as though my presence tainted the memory of their grandfather. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, voices drifted from the adjoining room. "Don't worry," one of Harold's daughters said, her tone sharp. "She won't get a penny. Dad's real family is us." Her brother chuckled. "Exactly." Let her play the grieving widow. Once the will is read, she'll be out of the house in a week. Their laughter, cruel and certain, twisted the knife deeper. I set the cup down before my hands betrayed me with a tremor. So that was it. To them, I wasn't a wife. I was a placeholder, a shadow standing in the way of what they believed was theirs. I returned to my table, face composed, though inside I felt the ground tilting. Around me, guests carried on as if nothing had happened, but I heard only the echo of those words. Dad's real family is us. They had already stripped me of my place in their lives. Soon, they believed, they would strip me of everything else too. What they didn't realize, what Harold and I had quietly decided in those long nights of honesty before the end, was that family is not defined by blood alone, and he had made sure of it. The reception dragged on. Laughter rose from one corner of the hall, not the laughter of remembrance, but of ridicule. Harold's children gathered in a tight circle, their eyes flicking toward me before they leaned in closer, whispering like conspirators. I sat alone at a table, folding and unfolding a napkin in my lap. People who had once called me Mrs. Thompson now avoided my gaze. They smiled politely, offered platitudes, then drifted toward the stepchildren as though aligning themselves with the real family. When I tried to sit with them, a chair was pulled back just out of reach, as though I didn't belong. Their laughter grew louder, sharp and careless. It was in that moment I felt the first true crack in the facade of mourning. Across the room, my late husband's sister, Margaret, approached and touched my shoulder. "You did right by Harold," she said softly. "Don't let their cruelty make you forget that." Her words were a balm, but they couldn't drown out the sharper voices behind me. "It's only a matter of time," one stepdaughter whispered. "Once the will is read, she'll be out of the house in a week." Her brother snickered. "And good riddance." That house was Dad's before she ever came along. It's ours by right. I clenched the napkin tighter. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of the younger sons, Michael, shift uncomfortably. His voice was lower, hesitant. "I don't know. Dad seemed different toward the end. Maybe we shouldn't be so sure." Maisie, the eldest, shot him a withering glare. "Don't be naive." "She's a leech." Dad knew who his real family was. Michael fell silent, shoulders hunched. That flicker of doubt in his eyes was brief, but I saw it, and in that flicker I realized not all of them were as certain as they pretended. Margaret sat with me as the chatter continued, her presence a fragile shield against their malice. But the damage was done. They weren't grieving. They were circling, waiting like vultures for the lawyer to speak. I smoothed the napkin one last time and placed it on the table. My heart raced, not from fear, but from a dawning clarity. They believed I had no place here, that once the will was read, I would vanish like a shadow. But Harold and I had shared too many nights of truth, too many whispered promises, for me to believe their version of the future. The crack had formed. Soon it would widen. By late afternoon, the reception hall had thinned. Plates sat half-eaten, coffee grown cold. Guests whispered goodbyes and slipped out into the winter dusk. Only family remained, and the lawyer. Arthur Gray, Harold's longtime attorney, entered quietly, his black briefcase in hand. The room stilled as he approached the front table. The stepchildren straightened in their chairs, smug anticipation etched across their faces. Maisie leaned toward her brothers. "Here it comes," she whispered. "She'll be out on the street by tomorrow." I folded my hands in my lap, my pulse steady. Arthur placed the briefcase on the table and clicked it open. Inside lay a neat stack of papers secured with a gold clip. "Before we proceed," Arthur began, "I want to remind you all that your father, Harold Thompson, was of sound mind and body at the time this document was executed. He made these choices freely, and they were witnessed and notarized according to state law." He glanced at me briefly, then at the others. I knew Harold for over 30 years. We shared more than legal business. Many mornings, he'd stop by my office just for coffee. Once, not long before his health declined, he told me, "If anything happens, make sure she's never left unprotected." He trusted me with that, and today I intend to honor it. A ripple of unease spread across the room. Arthur cleared his throat and began to read. "I, Harold Thompson, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He slid the crisp papers across the polished table, the gold seal catching the overhead light, Harold's signature bold and unshakable at the bottom. The stepchildren leaned forward eagerly. "I bequeath the sum of $1 each to my biological children, Maisie, Daniel, and Michael, in acknowledgement of our relationship." The air shattered. Maisie shot to her feet. $1? That's a joke." Arthur raised a hand. "Please, let me finish." He continued, voice calm but firm. The entirety of my estate, including the family home, savings accounts, investments, and personal effects, is to pass to my wife, Margaret Thompson, in gratitude for her years of care and devotion. The room exploded. Daniel cursed under his breath. Maisie slammed her fist on the table. "This is fraud! He'd never—" Michael sat frozen, pale, his eyes darting toward me with something like guilt. Arthur tapped the notarized seal at the bottom of the page. "This document is legally binding." It was updated 6 months ago in my office, with full witnesses present. Maisie's voice cracked. She tricked him. She manipulated him when he was weak. I lifted my chin, meeting her glare. Weak? I bathed him, fed him, held his hand when none of you were here. Don't call that weakness. Call it love. I looked at the circle of stunned faces and spoke not just to them, but to anyone who might judge. Me. Tell me, if you were me, would you have stayed silent while they mocked you? Or would you, like Harold, make sure dignity triumphed over cruelty? Silence followed. For the first time all day, their mocking smiles had vanished. The room buzzed with disbelief. Voices overlapped. Anger, denial, shock. Maisie paced like a caged animal, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Daniel muttered to himself, fists clenched. Michael sat in silence, his face pale. And me? For the first time that day, I sat straighter. All morning, I had felt like an intruder in Harold's life. Mocked, whispered about, shoved aside. But with Arthur's words, the balance shifted. I wasn't the outsider. I was the woman Harold trusted in the end. I folded my hands neatly on the table and breathed deeply. I thought of the years with Harold. Quiet mornings over coffee, evenings when his body failed him, but his spirit stayed strong. He had told me once, "Family isn't who mocks you when you're down. It's who stands by you when you can't stand yourself." Those words echoed now, louder than the storm around me. Maisie slammed her hand down. "This isn't over." She tricked him. Arthur adjusted his glasses calmly. "It is over. This will is final. But there are additional clauses I've yet to read." The room stilled. Even Maisie paused, her fury momentarily quieted. Arthur tapped the folder. Harold was thorough. He left letters, instructions. This isn't just about money, it's about legacy. A ripple of tension spread. I looked at my stepchildren then, not with fear, but with clarity. "You mocked me at your father's funeral," I said quietly, "but you forgot who he trusted when it mattered most." The words hung heavy, more powerful than any shout. Arthur shuffled the pages deliberately. There are still sealed letters to be opened. If you want to hear Harold's voice one last time, stay. If not, leave now. My heart thudded. The others exchanged glances torn between pride and curiosity, and in that pause I realized the story was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when funerals end in whispers instead of hymns. By the next morning, neighbors had already heard pieces of the story. "They mocked her at the service," one woman murmured over coffee at the diner. "Then the will, oh, you should have seen their faces." At Sunday service, I later heard, the gossip spread further. Church friends shook their heads in disbelief. Can you believe they laughed at her and then lost everything? The humiliation that Maisie and Daniel thought they'd delivered to me was now theirs to carry. Back at the hall, Arthur laid out the next set of documents. The stepchildren had stayed, too stunned or too proud to leave. Margaret, Harold's sister, sat beside me, her hand on mine, a quiet anchor against the storm. Arthur spoke with deliberate calm. "There are additional clauses," Maisie scoffed. "Clauses? What else could there possibly be?" Arthur unfolded a sealed letter, Harold's handwriting still strong across the page. He read aloud, "To my children, you may believe blood entitles you to everything I built. But family is proven by presence, not by birth. In my last years, Margaret was the one who never left my side. To her, I leave not only my estate, but my gratitude. You will find your inheritance in the memories you neglected to make." Arthur held up the page so all could see. The ink strokes of Harold's hand, steady and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the room. The words cut sharper than any legal stamp. Daniel slammed his chair back, muttering curses. Maisie's face drained of color. Michael lowered his head, shame etched across his features. Arthur continued steady. "In accordance with Harold Thompson's wishes, the family home savings and investments are to pass entirely to his wife, Margaret Thompson. This includes the lake cabin, retirement funds, and all personal effects." The air seemed to crackle. Maisie sprang to her feet. "This is outrageous!" Margaret's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Outrageous! Outrageous is mocking a widow at her husband's funeral." The hall grew silent. Even the hum of the heater seemed to pause. Arthur tapped the notarized seal once more. "This clause is final. It leaves no room for dispute." Twist after twist had led to this moment, but this was the blow that ended their fight. The inheritance they'd mocked me for chasing had never been theirs. It was mine, by law, by love, and by Harold's choice. Maisie's voice sliced through the silence. "This is fraud. She must have forced him. Dad would never cut us out like this." Daniel's chair screeched across the floor as he leapt to his feet. "I'll contest it. I'll drag this through every court until the truth comes out." Arthur remained unshaken. He lifted the letter once more, his voice steady. "The truth has already come out. This is Harold's handwriting. This is his signature. And this," he tapped the notary seal, heavy with ink, "is the law." Maisie stormed toward the table, jabbing a finger at me. "She manipulated him. She poisoned his mind." I rose slowly, my hands resting against the polished wood. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. Poisoned? I was the one who held his hand when he couldn't breathe. I was the one who turned him every night when his body failed. Where were you? At parties? On vacations? You left him to me. The words hung, sharp and undeniable. Michael shifted uneasily. "She's right," he muttered, almost to himself. Maisie spun on him, furious. "Don't you dare take her side!" Arthur reached into his folder and withdrew another page. "For the record," he said calmly, "Harold signed this amendment 6 months ago, witnessed by myself, a nurse, and a church deacon. All of them attested to his clarity of mind." He slid the page across the table. The bold ink of Harold's name gleamed under the overhead light. I reached out and laid my palm flat over Harold's name, feeling the grooves of his pen strokes as if his hand still guided mine. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater. That silence was the true quiet climax. No more accusations could blot out the reality staring them in the face. Their father's hand, his words, his seal. The loudness of their rage collapsed into the quiet finality of truth. Maisie's fury dissolved into disbelief. Her shoulders sagged, her lips quivered. Daniel swore under his breath, then stormed out, the doors slamming behind him. Michael sat frozen, caught between loyalty to siblings and the guilt he could no longer hide. I placed my hand gently on the signed page, tracing Harold's name with my fingertips. "You mocked me at his funeral," I whispered, "but in the end his voice silenced you." The aftershock rippled outward. Neighbors exchanged looks. Church friends who had once averted their eyes now met mine with quiet respect. Margaret squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with vindication. Arthur gathered the papers into his briefcase, his voice final. "The matter is settled. Harold's estate belongs to his wife. That was his choice, his will, his love." And in that moment, their laughter, the ridicule that had stung so deep just hours before, was gone. All that remained was silence, heavy and humiliating. The church hall emptied slowly, the heavy doors groaning shut behind the last of the guests. Only silence remained, silence and the echoes of what had been revealed. Daniel had already stormed out, his curses still lingering in the cold night air. Maisie slumped in her chair, pale and trembling, her confidence shattered. Michael sat quietly, eyes downcast, unable to meet mine. For years they had seen me as the outsider, the woman who didn't belong, who was undeserving of their father's love. But now, before their very eyes, Harold's own words had rewritten the story. I stood, my hands brushing against the edge of the table where his will still rested. "This wasn't about money," I said softly, more to myself than to them. This was about respect. About truth, Margaret walked with me to the door. "He chose you because you chose him every single day," she whispered. "Don't ever forget that." I nodded, my chest heavy with both grief and relief. Respect, dignity. That was the inheritance Harold had left me, far beyond property or bank accounts. Behind me, Maisie finally muttered, her voice breaking. "He should have left it to us. We're his blood." I turned back only once. "Blood may bind, but love proves itself, and you turned your backs long ago." Her face crumpled and she said nothing more. "Now I turn to you, the one listening to this story. If you stood in my place, mocked by those who should have shown compassion, would you forgive them once the truth came out? Or would you let them live with the shame they created for themselves?" As I stepped into the cold evening air, the night sky stretched wide above me. Snowflakes drifted in the lamplight, quiet and soft, as though the world itself was finally at peace. And yet I knew this was just one battle in 1,000 families, because sometimes the most bitter fights aren't at funerals. They're in the lawyer's office, around the dinner table, or in the quiet reading of a will. And next week, I'll tell you about the siblings who discovered their father's estate and tore each other apart in ways no one expected. The following week, I sat alone in Harold's study. His chair still carried the faint scent of pipe tobacco, the shelves lined with the books he loved. I ran my hand along the worn wood of his desk, where his pen still rested. For years, his children had tried to make me feel small, as though I were nothing more than a placeholder in his life. But Harold's final act proved otherwise. He had chosen me publicly, permanently, undeniably. I whispered into the quiet room, "They mocked me at your funeral, Harold, but your will carried your voice, and it silenced them." The words steadied me, filling the silence with a kind of peace. Michael came by once, standing awkwardly at the door. "I didn't know he'd changed everything," he said softly. "Maybe I should have been there more." I looked at him, my heart heavy. "Maybe you should have. But it's not too late to live differently." He lowered his head, and though no reconciliation was complete, the possibility flickered there. I turned then, not just to him, but to you, the one listening. If you were in my place, mocked by those who should have offered comfort, would you let bitterness harden, or would you search for forgiveness in the ashes? Tell me below, because stories like this don't end in silence. They live on in the choices we make next. I closed Harold's study door gently, leaving the light off. Some chapters end in laughter, some in tears. Mine ended in truth. Through the window, a single snowflake clung to the glass, refusing to melt. I watched it glow in the lamplight, fragile yet enduring, just like the truth Harold left behind. And truth, I realized, was its own inheritance. And remember, this isn't the end. Next week, we'll open a will that split siblings apart, proving that sometimes the deepest scars appear long after the funeral is over. Every family is different. If you ever face something like this, make sure you seek the advice and support that's right for you.